Welcome to the Productivity Show, a podcast where we believe that you can get the important things done without having to sacrifice your health, family, and things that matter to you. My name is Tam Pham. I'm the founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life. And one of the things I always like to say is that happy people are productive people. I started this in 2011 purely as a passion project, and it accidentally turned into a business that it is today, 13 years later now. And I'm really excited to dive into today's topic about the best note-taking apps, but I won't be doing this alone. I have my co-host Brooks Duncan joining me here today. How are you today, Brooks?
I'm great. Just before recording, Tan and I were talking about 90s throwbacks, which is, of course, is one of my favorite topics. So yeah, I'm good to go.
So would you mind sharing a little bit about your background before we start talking about note-taking apps so people kind of know who you are if you're new to the show?
Yeah, so I've worked in corporate, I've worked in startups, I've worked in government. My productivity journey really started when I was just overwhelmed at work. In my corporate job, I was director of client services, and I heard of this book called Getting Things Done, so I decided to buy it, and I literally spent an entire weekend in my office, downtown Vancouver, just surrounded by notes and trying to get organized. And eventually I got to that mind like water state, and it's been ever since. I've been really big into productivity, and I'm super thankful that I get to translate that into being on the podcast and helping all of you with your productivity as well. And like Tan said, sometimes it's Tan and I. Those episodes are great. Sometimes we have guests as well. But what we always want to do is we want to make sure every single episode that we do is super actionable. We want to give you actionable productivity tips and insights. And we really like getting feedback from listeners. So we heard from a listener named Zofia, and Zofia writes, I've already recommended you to my husband, and he's listened to some of your podcast episodes. And so thanks so much for sharing that, Zofia. We love hearing that. And if you're listening to this, and if there's someone in your life, either work or personal, that you think would enjoy the podcast, let them know about it. We want to expand the podcast using word of mouth, so you can let anyone else know. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@asianefficiency.com, or even better, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So Tan, we're going to be doing almost the impossible and tackling a very controversial topic, which is the best note-taking apps. So why don't you tell everybody what they're going to get out of this episode?
So we're going to be talking about a note-taking app that used to be kind of like Evernote. So if you missed the old days of how Evernote used to be, then we have a great recommendation for you here coming up. Also, we're going to be talking about a note-taking app that could literally take over your whole life and business and house everything in one place. So this is a tool that has become super popular. I think it's worth over $10 billion now. So maybe you already know what that might be. But the third and final recommendation that we'll make here is a tool or a note-taking app that is kind of like what they call a PKM, a personal knowledge management system. And so we're going to show you one that is pretty cool that a lot of people seem to like. So if you're more into like the geeky side of things in terms of note-taking, then I think this is the tool that you'll want to check out. And as always, when we do the podcast, before we get into the content, we want to share some of our favorite resources on this topic. So the first one I want to share with you is a book called How to Remember Names and Faces the Easy Way by Ron White, who's a 2-time USA memory champion. So speaking of note-taking, we'll all take notes because we want to remember stuff, right? However, I read this book many years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and the book teaches you how to remember names. And what's cool about it is that he teaches a framework that is really simple to use and easy to remember. And if you're able to use this tool, you'll start to notice that you'll be able to remember more stuff in your meetings as well, not just the names that you have come across when you were going to a dinner party or someone else's house. And you're like, oh, who was this person again? Like after reading that book, you'll get a better sense of how to remember names, but also you'll see this transfer in other areas of your life. Speaking of, since we're typing and taking a lot of notes, a tool that you definitely want to check out is called Text Expander. Text Expander is an app that allows you to type fast and with a few keystrokes. You can then complete whole sentences or even write full paragraphs and even write code and have templates all built out in front of you. So think of it as a keyboard that you have with a few keystrokes to able to write something very quickly. So something that might take you normally 5-10 seconds to write, you can do it in like half a second. So it's something that I recommend everyone becomes familiar with, and it's available on Mac, iOS, and Windows as well. And then the third one is another book called How to Take Smart Notes, One Simple Technique to Boost Writing, Learning, and Thinking. And we'll link to this in the show notes. This book explains a methodology called Zettelkasten, and it's essentially a note-taking method. So it's one thing to have note-taking apps. It's another thing to be able to write really good notes. And this book will show you how to write really good notes that are effective, simple, easy to digest, and easy to reference. So go check it out if you're taking a lot of notes.
And really thankful for sharing. Thanks so much for sharing that, Tan. I'm right after hitting record. Thanks so much for sharing that, Tan. Right after we stop recording, I'm buying that book about remembering names and faces because I'm horrible with that. And if you're horrible with that too, I've got you. And you can find links to everything that we share in the show notes by going to theproductivityshow.com, or you can just swipe in your podcast app and there'll be a link there. And you can find us on YouTube. So go to theproductivityshow.com/YouTube for the full length episodes, or you can go to theproductivityshow.com/clips where we break down our episodes into short little digestible clips. So either way, check those out. And now let's get into the topic, which is the best note-taking apps. And you might be asking yourself a question, which is even possible to choose a best note-taking app? Well, we are going to try, and it is so difficult because there's just so many note-taking apps, and it's actually a growth industry right now. It seems like every day there's a new note-taking app or an app that is now AI-powered, and it just seems like every week there's a new one, and it's hard too because note-taking apps are so personal. But what we're going to do is we're going to choose 3 note-taking apps that we think are the best right now that we think you should take a look at. So if you're looking for a new note-taking app, we think these 3 apps can make anyone more productive. But Tan, if somebody is looking for a note-taking app, what are some of the features that are critical or maybe at least really good to have for a note-taking app? Like, what should people be thinking about as they are evaluating these apps?
One of the most critical features for note-taking apps is that it has to be easy and fast to use. Any note-taking app that is slow or difficult will be an app that you will stop using after a while, because you will find yourself in many situations where something comes up and you have to take a note down right away. And if the app is slow or there's a lot of friction to writing stuff down, you'll find yourself in situations where you don't even want to use the app anymore, and then you forget stuff. So being fast and easy to use is my primary key feature that I always look for when I'm evaluating a note-taking app. Another thing that I want to think about is it has to be synchronized. Any good note-taking app that can sync up with multiple devices is one that I would always choose over a note-taking app that's only available on one particular app or platform. So that's something I want you to think about as well as you're evaluating your next note-taking app. And then the third one I would say is that any good note-taking app has to have good search features, meaning you should be able to find any note with very few keystrokes. And if you're somebody who doesn't do a good job of naming your stuff, you should still be able to find most of your notes. Now, ideally, we have both. You're really good at naming your notes and then also finding your notes, but sometimes we lack one or the other. So if it's one feature that I think every note-taking app should have is good searchability.
And by the way, we're talking about note-taking apps, but we're not saying you have to go out and download a new app. The ones that are built into our products are actually really, really good. So the Notes app that is built into Mac and iOS, or there is Google Keep on Android, or if you're in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, OneNote is great. And if these are working for you, you don't really need to go out and switch for the sake of switching. In fact, we would definitely not recommend that. But if you're maybe hitting some sort of limitations, or if you can switch, you're wanting some of the extra features that we're going to be talking about, well, these three we think are going to help you out. But we recommend if you're starting from zero, if you don't have a note-taking app right now, just start with, say, Apple Notes or OneNote or whatever, and then only switch if you feel the need. And Tan, I heard a rumor. I actually didn't even know this. It was an offhand comment that you made recently. I heard a rumor that you're actually spending a lot of time now using Apple Notes. A, is that true? And B, if it is, how's it going just using that?
In the last few years, I started using Apple Notes more often because, one, it's all over the Apple ecosystem, and I am fully bought into the Apple ecosystem. I have an iPad, I have an iPhone, I have a MacBook Air, and a MacBook or a Mac Mini, and so I'm all in. And so it makes sense for me to use a note-taking app that's synchronized across all devices on the same account, and that's also easy and simple to use, which is what Apple Notes is. And so in the beginning, I would just use it as like a really simple shopping list, but nowadays I use it as almost my primary note-taking app when I can. Even though I still use Evernote, and I have tens of thousands of notes in there because I've been a user for over a decade now, I tend to prefer putting stuff now into Apple Notes whenever I can because, one, Evernote has been bought out and has new management, so I'm not quite sure how good it will be moving forward. So I'm kind of like diversifying my risk a little bit. And the second thing is I actually enjoy using the Apple Notes app because it's so simple, so easy to use. And what features it didn't have a few years ago, it does have now. You can put images in there, rich text, you can search for stuff, you can organize stuff, and it's very simple to use. And if you're not a power user at all, I think Apple Notes is a great tool to use. Now, if you are a power user where you have to like link notes and create like relationships between notes and you want to use it more as like a management system of content, then I think Apple Notes is not really for you. It's really designed for people who want to take notes, use it on an everyday basis, have it on older devices, and it's just simple to use.
Well, let's get into it. And Tan, you mentioned the E word, which is Evernote, but that is not my first app recommendation. Evernote's still great, like you said. I still use it in the sense that I still have tons of notes in Evernote and I still access them all the time. Tan, you said you have 10,000. I'm probably around there too. But the first app I want to recommend is if you generally like the way that Evernote has traditionally looked and traditionally worked, I recommend that you check out an app called Nimbus Note. It's really similar to how Evernote used to be, kind of like classic Evernote. It's cross-platform, so it's on the web, it's on Mac, it's on Windows, it's on iOS, it's on Android, and it has search. You can put in things like tables and tasks and lists and really anything else you want for a good looking and a well-structured note. But it has some things that are, I think, even a little better than Evernote. So for example, you can create a real folder structure. So Evernote, you're limited to the stacks and stuff like that. Nimbus Notes, you don't have to worry about that. You can create a folder structure the way that you want. And it also has a web clipper, which is honestly something that Evernote really, really shines in. And Nimbus Notes has a web clipper as well. So again, if you are kind of missing the Evernote days, or if you're starting from scratch and you like the way it looks, check out Nimbus Notes. We're not saying that you should get your stuff out of Evernote and move to Nimbus Note, although some people do that, but it may be worth trying Nimbus Note out and seeing how you like it. How about you, Tan? Have you taken a look at Nimbus Note? Have you formed any opinions on it?
To be honest, I've never heard of this until we prepared for this episode today. And when I looked into it, I was like, oh yeah, this is very similar to Evernote. It has the same look and feel, very similar feature set. And when you said that it was how Evernote used to be, I immediately went, yeah, this is what it used to be. So I personally haven't played around with it myself, so I can't personally recommend it quite yet. And so that's something I want to check into as well, because like we've talked about in other videos, I'm not a huge fan of Evernote as a recommendation right now, just because it's been taken over by a European company. They have new management, and they haven't really released what they're trying to do with it. So I'm a little bit hesitant right now to recommend Evernote as an app for notes. And so that's that's one of the reasons I'm starting to use Apple Notes more, but I'm open to other note-taking apps now, such as Nimbus Note, to see if this could eventually replace Evernote, because migrating notes is kind of a pain. Takes a lot of work, especially when you have like over 10,000 notes like I do, and there's a lot of valuable information there. Switching note-taking apps can be a little bit of a painful process. So if I'm going to pick something, I want to make sure I'm making the right decision. So I'm taking notes on Nimbus Note.
And it's a little unfair to only frame it as being something that is tied to Evernote. There's no relationship there. It's its own thing. So even if you've never used Evernote before, I still recommend that you check out Nimbus Note because it's a nice looking app and it works well. But for those of us who do have that warm bath feeling of classic Evernote, recommend that you check it out. Another thing that I recommend you checking out is actually a product that we created, and it's a resource called Automation Academy. And the thing about note-taking is so much of it can be automated. Tan, you mentioned Text Expander earlier. That is an aspect of automation, but there's so much you can automate with creating notes, accessing notes, sharing notes. And the problem is it can be kind of challenging to set this up sometimes. There's a lot of things to learn. And of course, anyone listening to this podcast is smart. You can all learn it. But sometimes it's just easier to have things done for you and to have step-by-step exactly what to do. So that's why we created Automation Academy. It's an online course where you can help automate your work. So you spend less time working and more time getting stuff done. That's what it's all about. So if this sounds good to you, check it out at theproductivityshow.com/automation. And I really liked Automation Academy. I loved creating it, and I know you're going to get a lot of value out of it. With that said, Tan, I'm going to give the floor to you. So I chose Nimbus Note as my first recommendation. How about your recommendation?
My recommendation for a note-taking app would be the conglomerate, the king, the one that's taking over the world right now, and that is Notion. Notion is probably the most popular note-taking app right now. The company is valued at around $10 billion, which is a huge company when you think about it. And here's the interesting thing about Notion is that it's more than just a note-taking app. It has become this whole content management tool with database features. You can let you run your whole life, your whole company in it. So a lot of people use it for personal use, but also there's a ton of usage for businesses as well. So it's very flexible in that sense, how you use the tool. And you don't have to have any technical skills or coding skills to be able to use it. You can use it out of the box. It's fully web-based. And I would say one of the downsides of Notion is that it is fully web-based. It's not really made for offline use quite yet. So if you compare all the note-taking apps, I would say the weakest area for Notion is the offline portion of it, because everything is web-based and you always need an internet connection to really use it. And so if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of connection, you want to be able to take notes, synchronize notes, and so on, that's one thing I would take into account when you're considering Notion. But most people that I know nowadays, they either use Notion partially or they use it all together for their life and business. And it's up to you how you want to use it. And because the company is well-funded, has been around for a few years now, a lot of people, even in the productivity industry, they have their own Notion templates. They have their own way of using Notion. They sell their own methods, their own systems of how to use it and such. So it's become really popular. And it kind of reminds me of Evernote of like 10, 15 years ago. When it just started off, everyone was on the Evernote bandwagon, right, including myself. Everyone was selling courses on Notion and templates and how you should use it and stuff. And people had full-time jobs because of the note-taking app. And Notion is kind of like that right now. That's like the new renaissance of note-taking apps that's going on right now. So it's kind of interesting to see. It has a lot of the same features that other note-taking apps have, like having a web clipper. That's something that Evernote kind of like did first really well. And Notion has this as well. And it's one of the killer features that I use all the time. So when I'm evaluating an app, that's something I always want to look into as well. But the template feature, I think, is the one that really pushed Notion over the edge. Not only are they innovating, they're always updating code and stuff like that, but also there's a lot of influencers, creators, and people like you and I just everyday people who would create templates and then share them with other people to simplify how they do stuff. And by having a template library and a marketplace where people can kind of share information and workflows and how they do stuff, it created this network effect of people wanting to use the tool even more so, and making it really easy for others to use the tool. So I think that's one of the key successes of Notion, and also just the major influencers on YouTube and other platforms that just push Notion all the time because they love it and they teach their own methodology and system.
I think you're so right about the templates being kind of like the killer app of Notion, because the thing about it is whatever you want to do, somebody has probably already done it. So for example, recently I was using Notion because I wanted to track all of my son's university applications. So I have some notes there, and then I created a little database so that we could track like the status of each one and stuff like that. And yeah, I could have built it all from scratch. That would be no problem. But I noticed that there was a job application template, and I figured, hey, I can just take that, change the names, tweak it a little bit, and it was exactly what I needed. So you can get up to speed really, really quickly with whatever it is you want to do. And you are so right about it becoming mainstream now. So for example, I was in London a few months ago, and I was walking around, and Notion kind of started, like you said, just amongst productivity enthusiast type people, but almost every second bus I saw going through London and bus shelters and stuff like that all had big Notion advertisements. And even maybe a week or two ago, my son came downstairs and he was holding his phone. He said, "Oh, Dad, I'm trying to get more organized at school. So I downloaded this new productivity app." And I said, "Oh, what is it?" I had no idea. And then he showed me Notion. So when even high school students start using it, and I had never mentioned it to him at all, when even high school students start using it, then you know it's starting to really get mainstream. So I totally agree with you. It can be as simple and easy as you want, but it can also be as complex as you want as well. Like last week, we talked to Francesco D'Alessio about his app Tool Finder, which is a whole website, and that whole thing is built on Notion. And it's just insane the stuff you can do with it. So this is a great choice for your note-taking app, because you can do pretty much anything you want with Notion, which is great.
All right, so that wraps up the Notion portion here. So Brooks, what is the third recommendation for a note-taking app that you have?
I really hesitated with this one because PKM apps, or personal knowledge management apps, like you mentioned earlier, are so powerful and so popular right now, but they can be a big rabbit hole as well. But I'm going to do it anyway. My recommendation for a note-taking app is Obsidian. And like I mentioned, Obsidian is a personal knowledge management app, or PKM. And the idea is you're not just taking notes. So this isn't just firing up Apple Notes and writing some notes. Really, the idea behind Obsidian is you are creating your own knowledge ecosystem. So the power becomes really unlocked when you start linking these notes together and making dashboards and stuff like that, and really having this growing ecosystem of notes that really allow you to make connections and get access to information you might not have even thought about on its own. Way back in TPS448, so you can go to theproductivityshow.com/387. We talked to Nick Milo, and he calls it note making, not note taking. And I really like that idea of you're creating your knowledge ecosystem. You're not just writing down some notes that come to mind. The reason I was hesitant to mention Obsidian as my pick, and it's the reason why every time I've kind of started to use it, I've ended up stopping, at least so far, is because it is so tempting once you get into the Obsidian ecosystem to basically spend all your time messing around with it. So every time I see someone's Obsidian setup and they have plugins and they have like front matter and they have all these codes and stuff like that that reference this and that, and I've even taken Obsidian courses and stuff like that, I think, oh, that is so cool. I love what they're doing, but at the end of the day, it just seems like so much busy work, at least for me. For the people who are really into it, and if you know of yourself, if you have this kind of personality where you can get into it responsibly, then it's amazing. But for me, I don't have that personality. I know I'll just spend all my time messing around with plugins and stuff like that. So for the right person, Obsidian is an amazing tool. So that's why I decided to include it. And Obsidian is available for Mac, it's available for Windows, it's available for Linux, for iOS, for Android. And one thing people really like about it that the rest of the note-taking apps that we've been talking about doesn't have is it just stores your notes in plain markdown text. So why that is important is you mentioned earlier that it's really difficult to move from note-taking app to note-taking app, which is so true. But the fact that Obsidian stores your notes just in plain text means this is one case where it's really easy. Your stuff isn't locked into one vendor's ecosystem. You don't need to worry about this vendor being sold or shutting down or whatever. If all of a sudden Obsidian, for whatever reason, just stopped working, it almost wouldn't matter because all your notes are in text. So that's really great, but I personally haven't been consistent with the Notion bandwagon, or I personally haven't been consistent with the Obsidian bandwagon, but I think new features like Obsidian Canvas, which we talked about a few episodes ago, which adds a visual way to work with your notes, I think that will make it more accessible without having to do all these crazy hacks to get what you want to see. How about you, Tan? Does this idea of a connected note ecosystem, is it appealing to you? Have you tried Obsidian? What do you think about it?
I've definitely tried Obsidian, but I was never really into it because the complexity is too high for most people, including myself. So I like the idea that notes are connected because ideas are connected. And when we think about our brain, there's a lot of stuff stored in there. And there's all these connections that are happening between all the different thoughts that we have and all the different memories. And there's a lot of new ideas that come out of that because they're all somewhat interconnected. And ideally, our notes would be like that as well. However, when it comes to the actual app, when it comes to using Obsidian, I find that the barrier to entry is just a little higher. And you also have to buy into the fact that this is how they do note-taking and this is how it works. And if you don't buy into that methodology or system, then this is not the app for you. Right? So if someone asks me, what is your favorite note-taking app that you recommend for people, then you would have all these different options available, right? Like if you're somebody who wants to have like a PKM type of system, then Obsidian is great. And that's something I would recommend, even though I don't personally use it. However, if you're somebody who is just extremely busy, overwhelmed, wants to keep it really simple, and if you're a Mac user, then using something like Apple Notes is the way to go. It's really easy to use, most accessible. And if you're a Windows user, then maybe use something that's a little bit more cross-platform, right? So like Nimbus Note could be like a great way to do that then. So there's not one best note-taking app. And if you made it this far, I think you already realize that, right? But we wanted to give you some options that you can pick from. And when it comes to Obsidian, I think the learning curve is a little higher compared to most. But as a result, it's also much more powerful compared to some of the other apps that we've listed before. So it's kind of a trade-off that you have to make. It's one of the reasons why I never got into DevonThink, which is like the OG, note-taking app that has all the super powerful features. Because again, the learning curve was so high that you would have to read an ebook or a book to understand how to use the app. And if you got over that hump, then you're a power user and you can do some amazing things. But most people just can't get over that hump. I think, in fact, the trend right now is the less we have to think, the less we have to learn, the more adoptable it will be. And that's for any technology. The simpler it is, the faster we use it. And when we looked at ChatGPT, it's like the fastest growing platform or tool ever built and invented because it gathered the most users in the shortest period of time compared to anything else. And it's because, one, we had a use case for it right away, and it was really simple to use. And Obsidian is not quite like that, and so that's why I find it a little difficult to. That's why I find it a little difficult to recommend it for most people, unless you're like a little bit tech savvy. You know what the value is of a PKM or a management tool for content. Then you'll know that Obsidian is a good option. But for most people, I would say stay away from it. use the simple tools, get good at using those. And if you then run into limitations, then look into something like Obsidian.
I guess that's a good rule of thumb for note-taking apps. If you have to read an ebook or if you have to watch 10 YouTube videos to make good use of it, that's a good sign you want to think hard about adopting it, because it's probably a little too complex for what you might need at this time. But I will say, if the concept of a connected note-taking But I will say, if the concept of a connected note ecosystem is appealing to you, give it a try. That's the best thing to do. Just try these things out. And it might work for you, even though it hasn't personally for me and for Tan. But the advice I would give is, don't worry about plugins. Don't worry about copying people's systems that you see on YouTube or something. Just keep it super simple at first. Just focus on note taking and you can expand. All right, Tan. So we've given a bunch of different examples of note-taking apps, the ones we think are the best, at least as of right now. What should people do as a next step if they want to get into note-taking, or if they want to kick some time? What should people do with this information?
If you made it this far, you probably have a good idea which note-taking app resonates most with you. It's one of the three, so pick the one and then give it a try for 2 weeks. Just install it, download it right now as you're listening to this, and open up the app and see if you like it. Give it a try for about 2 weeks, because that will give you a better sense if you actually like it and know how to use it. And then you're not committed to it for the rest of your life either. So if you're already using another note-taking app or you're not quite happy with it, try another one for 2 weeks and see how it goes. And if you don't like it, you can always go back to your previous app. And everything that we mentioned today will be in the show notes. Just go to theproductivityshow.com. You'll find them all there. And if you enjoyed some of this content, we also have online courses available. You can go to theproductivityshow.com/automation to learn more about Automation Academy. So if you want to speed up your workflows, go check out that course. And if you want to be more efficient, continue to listen to The Productivity Show. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.